Welcome to Chapter 15, Part 2, The Special Senses. Today we're going to talk about the sense of smell and taste. So before we can begin that, we need to start with the very beginning in regards to the sense of smell. Now, the olfactory epithelium is the organ of smell. And let me just... olfactory epithelium way down here. So that's olfactory epithelial tissue located at the roof of your nasal cavity. So that's your nasal cavity roof, right? Okay. Inside there are tons and tons and tons of something called olfactory sensory neurons. Okay, and that would be here, for example. And those sensory neurons connect to the olfactory bulb. And notice where the olfactory bulb is located. It connects back to the brain. It's right underneath your brain. And these olfactory neurons are a particular type of bipolar neuron. And they have radiating olfactory cilia. So ultimately, this entire anatomy is incredibly significant because that cilia, along with the supporting cells, help to conduct the sense of smell and the function of this organ. Underneath, at the base of the epithelial tissue, we have olfactory stem cells that renew themselves. In order to smell a substance, anything, it has to be in a gas state. An odorant, for example. So here what we're looking at is we're looking at the inside anatomy of an individual who's smelling a flower. So if you smell this flower smells usually pretty good. And it's because they have these little tiny invisible odor molecules that are in the gas form. And once they're in the nasal cavity, then that odorant in that gas state, it will dissolve into the olfactory epithelium and get picked up by these olfactory neurons. The activity of these neurons is when it basically occurs when these odors reach the receptors, and then that smell is carried through the olfactory tract to the olfactory bulb and then to the brain for processing. Now this is a closer look at the olfactory bulb right here. Okay, you can see the bone, we can see connective tissue, and we can see the olfactory gland here, and then these are supporting cells. And if you keep going down, you'll see these little tiny olfactory hairs. Okay, and those olfactory hairs, they connect to the olfactory receptor, which of course then connects all the way up to the bulb and then to the olfactory neuron and sends the signal to the brain. So the type of receptors that are in, or the olfactory receptors, are chemoreceptors because they bind with a chemical, which is the odorant of the food, flour, whatever it is you're smelling. It is coming in as a chemical. Now, there is a correlation between taste and smell. When you chew your food, it releases odorants, and it is picked up by the olfactory receptors, which send the signals back to the brain via the olfactory bulb. Okay, now these neurons are bipolar. Remember, bi means two, Polar means two poles. So it just simply means it has a pole on this side and it's going to have another pole on this side. That means it's bipolar. All right, now ultimately what's happening here is unique because they do have a pretty unusual bipolar neuron in the sense that the dendrite of the actual neuron culminates or terminates into a knob structure. And on top of that, there's also large cilia and olfactory cilia. So see all of this? These all supporting cilia right there. Okay. Now this is all coming out of that particular knob. Now let me just make something clear here. This is what they mean by a knob. It's a cluster of neurons that come in together. All right, now ultimately, all of these nerves connect to the cranial nerve number 1, which we call the olfactory nerve. All of the olfactory receptors are bundled together in fascicles, creating this nerve, the olfactory nerve. It's one of your cranial/brain nerves. So let's talk a little bit more about these receptors. Now, the smells that we come across can contain hundreds of different odors. We have approximately 400 genes that are dedicated to smelling, and each gene encodes for a unique receptor that can respond to one or more odors, which gives us this plethora of abilities. Now, each odor will bind to a different receptor. That's just straight chemistry and biochemistry and cellular biology. Okay. Now, each receptor, unsurprisingly, has one type of receptor protein. What's interesting here is that pain and temperature receptors are also found in your nasal cavities, but it's helpful in the sense as a protection mechanism, so that when you smell something or sense something that's dangerous, like an irritant, like ammonia or something that's hot or cold or spicy or menthol, these pain and temperature receptors in your nasal cavity work with our olfactory receptors to help the brain determine what we are actually smelling. Now, the physiology of smell is relatively straightforward. Ultimately, what's going to happen here is, I'm going to just show you.
It's the first sense you use when you're born. 1 out of every 50 of your genes is dedicated to it. It must be important, right? Okay, take a deep breath through your nose. It's your sense of smell, and it's breathtakingly powerful. As an adult, you can distinguish about 10,000 different smells. Here's how your nose does it. Smell starts when you sniff molecules from the air into your nostrils. 95% of your nasal cavity is used just to filter that air before it hits your lungs. But at the very back of your nose is a region called the olfactory epithelium, a little patch of skin that's key to everything you smell. The olfactory epithelium has a layer of olfactory receptor cells, special neurons that sense smells, like the taste buds of your nose. When odor molecules hit the back of your nose, they get stuck in a layer of mucus covering the olfactory epithelium. As they dissolve, they bind to the olfactory receptor cells, which fire and send signals through the olfactory tract up to your brain. As a side note, you can tell a lot about how good an animal's sense of smell is by the size of its olfactory epithelium. A dog's olfactory epithelium is 20 times bigger than your puny human one. But there's still a lot we don't know about this little patch of cells, too. For example, our olfactory epithelium is pigmented, and scientists don't really know why. But how do you actually tell the difference between smells? It turns out that your brain has 40 million different olfactory receptor neurons. So odor A might trigger neurons 3, 427, and 988, and odor B might trigger neurons 8, 76, and 2,496,678. All of these different combinations let you detect a staggeringly broad array of smells. Plus, your olfactory neurons are always fresh and ready for action. They're the only neuron in the body that gets replaced regularly, every 4 to 8 weeks. Once those neurons are triggered, the signal travels through a bundle called the olfactory tract to destinations all over your brain, making stops in the amygdala, the thalamus, and the neocortex. This is different from how sight and sound are processed. Each of those signals goes first to a relay center in the middle of the cerebral hemisphere, and then out to other regions of the brain. But smell, because it evolved before most of your other senses, takes a direct route to these different regions of the brain, where it can trigger your fight or flight response, help you recall memories, or make your mouth water. But even though we've all got the same physiological setup, 2 nostrils and millions of olfactory neurons, not everybody smells the same things. One of the most famous examples of this is the ability to smell so-called asparagus pea. For about a quarter of the population, urinating after eating asparagus means smelling a distinct odor. The other 75% of us don't notice. And this isn't the only case of smells differing from nose to nose. For some people, the chemical androstenone smells like vanilla. To others, it smells like sweaty urine. Which is unfortunate because androstenone is commonly found in tasty things like pork. So with the sweaty urine smellers in mind, pork producers will castrate male pigs to stop them from making androstenone. The inability to smell a scent is called anosmia, and there are about 100 known examples. People with alicin anosmia can't smell garlic. Those with eugenol anosmia can't smell cloves. And some people can't smell anything at all. This kind of full anosmia can have several causes. Some people are born without a sense of smell. Others lose it after an accident or during an illness. If the olfactory epithelium gets swollen or infected, it can hamper your sense of smell, something you might have experienced when you were sick. And not being able to smell anything can mess with your other senses too. Many people who can't smell at all also can't really taste the same way the rest of us do. It turns out that how something tastes is closely related to how it smells. As you chew your food, air is pushed up your nasal passage, carrying with it the smell of your food. Those scents hit your olfactory epithelium and tell your brain a lot about what you're eating. Without the ability to smell, you lose the ability to taste anything more complicated than the 5 tastes your taste buds can detect: sweet, salty, bitter, sour, and savory. So the next time you smell exhaust fumes, salty sea air, or roast chicken, you'll know exactly how you've done it, and perhaps be a little more thankful that you can.
Okay, so the previous slide basically gives you this information, but I want to show it to you. So let's say that we were smelling the flower, okay, and the odorant molecules from the flower enter and bind with these receptors, the olfactory receptor. All right, now what ends up happening next is that receptor is going to activate something called G protein, specifically G-olf for G olfactory. There's more than one G protein. Now that G protein will in turn activate a protein called adenylate cyclase, which will then convert ATP into something called CAMP, cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP opens a cation channel, allowing sodium and calcium influx, which will depolarize the cell. Okay, depolarization is directly involved in neuronal activity. So this is ultimately how a chemical message, or yes, it's a message, will get converted into an electrical message to the brain. And allow you to smell. The next thing we're going to talk about is the sense of taste, because it goes in tandem with the sense of smell. Now, our taste buds are our sensory organ for taste. We have about 10,000 taste buds on the tongue in a structure that we call a papilla, which is these pig-like projections. See these little tiny, that's your papilla. So So you can feel it on your own tongue right now. All right, now there's different types. Okay, the fungal form papilla is scattered across the tongue, but it houses the most taste buds. Okay, now the sides, see these little lines, these walls? The foliate papilla are always along the sides of your tongue. And then we have our largest taste buds making a V in the back of the tongue right here. See that V? Okay, is a volate papilla. Now we have some taste buds in our soft palate, our cheek, our epiglottis, which is right there. Okay, and ultimately they all work together to allow you to taste various chemicals. Okay, now let's take a look at what we call a taste bud, which is actually a taste cell. Okay, they're inside of the folds of the papilla, so they're deep inside of there. So if we were looking at the tongue, okay, look at it this way. See all of this? This is the outside part of the tongue. And then, so technically this would be a papilla, and then inside is the taste bud. Now, these taste buds or these taste cells, they have supporting cells. So not every single one of these is an actual taste cell. So ultimately, this is the taste pore. Okay, the odorant or the chemicals will come in this way and get picked up by the taste bud itself, and that information is transferred to a major nerve, a major cranial nerve. Now, in taste as well as in smell, what's happening here is these are chemoreceptors. The taste cell itself has chemoreceptors in it that can bind with the dissolved food particles or other particles that are coming into the body and differentiate the taste. Talk about the location and structure of our taste buds. Now, each taste bud has anywhere from 50 to 100 epithelial cells. And there's two types. Grab this tool. The gustatory epithelial cells and the basal epithelial cells. The basal cells is very straightforward. These are simply stem cells that divide every 7 to 10 days to replace the cells that are in your tongue. Okay, so no surprise there. Remember basal, this term. Okay, now the gustatory ones, these are taste receptors that have microvilli called gustatory hairs that project right into your taste pore. Okay, so let's take a look, just like this. The gustatory hairs are here. This is your taste pore. That's what they mean. Okay, now what's interesting about them is that they're wrapped in sensory neurons that can send these taste signals right to the brain. Okay, let me go back to this picture. See these sensory neurons here? They pick that up, send it right to the brain. All right, so those are the gustatory epithelial cells. There's three types. One releases serotonin, one does not have any synaptic vesicles, and one releases ATP as a neurotransmitter, which is somewhat rare. Okay, now if we look closer, now you can see this papilla, right? This whole thing is one papilla. And then you can see a range of taste buds. Every taste bud is connected to a neuron. Very good. There's 5 basic tastes. Okay, we can taste bitter, salty, okay, and look at the location of the tongue. Okay, sour, sweet at the tip, and then the majority of your tongue is referred to as the sensation or taste sensation called umami. Now, something sweet is clearly going to be sugars, anything that has a saccharide in it, alcohol, some amino acids. Sour is going to pick up hydrogen ions. Salty will pick up metal ions like sodium chloride. Bitter will pick up alkaloids like nicotine, quinine, caffeine, non-alkaloids such as aspirin, for example. And then the umami taste bud is very interesting because it can taste MSG. It can taste amino acids like glutamate and aspartate. For example, we can taste this in beef when we eat beef or meat in general and cheese. And then we can taste monosodium glutamate, which is MSG, which they put in food. Now, scientists believe there's a possible sixth taste because there is growing evidence that demonstrates that human beings can actually taste the long chain of fatty acids that we saw in our lipids. And this would explain why we like fatty foods so much, because they do taste good. And ultimately, whether whether we like something or dislike the taste of something is very interesting how smart your body is, because those tastes, the likes and dislikes, they have homeostatic value. That means that they are there to protect you. For example, those taste buds can detect something that's beneficial or potentially harmful and react in a protective mechanism, a warning mechanism. For example, the sourness and bitterness is a protective way of warning us if something is spoiled or poisonous or dangerous. Being able to taste is very straightforward. When you eat, your food is dissolved into chemicals. These are chemoreceptors. That the chemicals of the food, the odorants, they have to be dissolved in your saliva. They have to be able to diffuse into a taste pore and contact those gustatory hairs and activate these taste receptors. Now, once the taste receptors are activated, then we have a full neuronal depolarization, and it allows the taste to be transferred from your mouth to your brain. Salty taste is due to an influx of sodium. No surprise there. This causes depolarization. Something that's sour is due to hydrogen ion acting on an intracellular level by opening other cationic channels. This is very different than eating something that doesn't have a salty or sour taste, for example. Okay, our unique receptors for sweet, bitter, and umami. We have those, but they're all coupled with G protein receptors. One in particular called Gustatory. This one activates, and it activates the release of calcium, which is stored typically, and the release of calcium will cause depolarization at a postsynaptic neuronal synapse, which, to put into layman's terms, basically is what I just keep saying over and over, is that ultimately it's going to be transferred to the brain. The gustatory pathway, so all of these neurons, they go back to the brain always, right? And there's two main cranial nerves that carry taste impulses. One is called the facial nerve, the glosopharyngeal nerve. And the first one will carry impulses from the anterior two sides of the tongue. Okay, so let's look at that. This is the facial nerve. See that? Okay, so the anterior 2/3 is going to be all of this. That's a lot. Okay, now back here, the glossopharyngeal is going to pick up over here and carry this information to the brain. And then we do have the vagus nerve, which is connected to the epiglottis and the lower pharynx that connects to the brain, but they all connect to the brain, and the brain is responsible for interpreting that information. When these neurons synapse into the medulla, now the medulla is going to send that information to the thalamus, and then inside of that system we have something called the gustatory cortex. So basically we have various parts of the brain involved in determining the taste of your food and also appreciating the taste of your food, especially if the hypothalamus and the limbic system are directly involved, which they are. Okay, what about the rest of it? What about things like gagging and vomiting and this sort of thing? All right, so the gustatory pathway is involved in that as well, because it does indeed trigger a reflex involved with digestion. So, for example, when you eat, the gustatory pathway is involved in releasing saliva into the mouth. When your food reaches your stomach and it's time to break it down, the gustatory pathway is involved in releasing and secreting gastric juices into the stomach. And it can also initiate protective reactions like gagging and reflective vomiting. Huge role. Now we do have the taste has a direct effect or a direct correlation with the sense of smell. So 80% of what you taste is the smell of the food. So if the nose is blocked, your food will be bland, right? Everyone's definitely gotten a cold and been stuffy and not been able to taste their food, and it's mostly because 80% of that is from your sense of smell. Therefore, the sense of smell and the sense of taste are directly connected. And ultimately, this is incredibly important because this explains quite a bit of why we smell our food or smell wine or anything before we eat it, and why we tend to not be able to eat something that doesn't smell good to us, right? Because of this correlation. No surprise there. Now, your mouth has thermoreceptors that pick up temperature, mechanoreceptors that can pick up physical vibrations or physical contact, right? And then we have nociceptors, okay, which are pain receptors. So ultimately, those thermoreceptors, they're going to allow us to detect heat and cold. And we can also feel the texture of our food. That's going to be the mechano. So this is a physical thing. Okay, so ultimately those two are picked up, right? And these two things can distract us from taste. If it's too hot or too cold, the taste is not going to be processed correctly. If the texture is off, that can also affect how the process of taste will be initiated to the brain. Spicy foods can excite pain receptors in the mouth, and that is where the burning sensation comes from when there are some people who experience pleasure from spicy food. And so, it just depends on the individual. But for the most part, most people, when they eat spicy food, it excites your pain receptors, and that's why it hurts. That's why it burns. Disorders of the taste, there's a handful. Usually they're led to or caused from an infection, an injury, medications, things like that. There are more issues with the sense of smell than the sense of taste.
Smile and learn!
Today, we're going to learn about the sense of taste. Have you noticed how salty this popcorn is? Or how sour this lemon is? Why do foods taste differently? All this is possible thanks to the sense of taste. The sense of taste allows us to identify and learn how foods taste. The tongue is the sensory organ responsible for tasting. The tongue is covered with bulbs called taste buds, also known as papillae, in charge of collecting information about different tastes and send it to the brain through the taste nerves. There are different types of taste buds grouped in separate parts of the tongue. The basic tastes that taste buds are able to identify are 5: sweet, salty, bitter, sour, and umami. That's it, you heard it right. Umami is the word we use to refer to incredibly delicious foods. The taste buds for sweet are on the tip of the tongue. The salt buds are on either side of the tongue. And the bitter taste buds are in the center of the back of the tongue, near the throat. The umami buds are in the middle of the tongue. The sour buds are located on either side and lower part of the tongue. There are many hints of flavors and savors produced by combining these 5 basic tastes. Did you know that the sense of taste and hearing communicate? That's why when we have a cold, food doesn't taste as good as it normally does. How interesting, right? Imagine eating this fruit. When we put it in our mouth, chemical substances in the apple communicate with the taste buds on the tongue. The taste buds transmit this information to the brain through the taste nerves. The brain is in charge of recognizing the type of taste and decide whether we like what we're tasting or not. Yum, this apple is so sweet. I love it. Yikes, this lemon is so sour. I don't like it at all. We experience tastes differently. That's why, even though one group of people may like the same food, another totally dislikes it. The sense of taste also helps to protect our health from foods that have gone bad. If these foods don't taste right, our brain will send signals to stop eating them. The sense of taste is amazing and essential for life. Don't you think so?
Did you like the video? We have so many more! Subscribe by clicking on the seal. And if you want to keep watching more videos, click on the boxes.